They didn't fire me. They didn't even demote me through some formal HR process or closed-door meeting. They sent me an email. A bland, 3-sentence email, no greeting, no signature, just a quiet little notification that, effective immediately, I would no longer be the vice president of operations. Instead, I'd be supporting the guest experience at the front desk of the Bourbon Royal Hotel. The hotel I helped save. The system I built. The staff I trained. The brand I rebuilt from ashes when no one else would touch it during the pandemic. They stripped me of my title, my office, my authority, but left me one thing: access. And they underestimated how dangerous that would be. You see, I've always been the type to stay late, arrive early, and keep my head down. I wasn't flashy. I didn't play politics. But I remembered everything. Every password. Every contract. Every cover-up, masked as optimization. So when they handed my legacy over to Colin Donnelly fresh out of a finance MBA and high on daddy's trust fund and his girlfriend Kylie, who thought running a boutique Instagram page made her operations ready, I knew exactly what they were doing. They wanted me gone, but not loud, not angry, just conveniently forgotten. So I let them think they'd won. I smiled. I nodded. I showed Kylie how to access the vendor dashboard. I even helped her set up 2-factor authentication she didn't understand. And while they celebrated their new leadership era over champagne on the rooftop bar, I was already 8 steps ahead, quietly gathering audit logs, downloading old memos, and syncing backup files they didn't know existed. You see, some people think revenge is loud. But the most powerful revenge? It's quiet, precise, and it walks through the front door wearing a name tag just before signing the paperwork to sell the very building out from under you. Let me tell you how I turned a demotion into a takeover. My name is Madison Green. I was never the loudest voice in the room. I didn't dress for attention, and I didn't chase recognition. I just worked. Quietly, relentlessly. Every system, every process, every spreadsheet, I built them like a fortress. Not to show off, not to impress, but because I knew what it felt like to have nothing to fall back on. I grew up in Baton Rouge, the eldest of 3. My mom was a night shift nurse, and my dad walked out before my 10th birthday. I learned early that if something was broken, you didn't cry about it, you learned to fix it. That's how I ended up in hotel operations. I didn't dream of hospitality. I fell into it because someone needed help reconciling vendor invoices, and I knew how to make a budget spreadsheet sing. By 34, I had helped stabilize 3 properties across the Gulf Coast region, implemented an automated payroll system that cut costs by 18%, and personally negotiated vendor contracts that kept our flagship hotel from going under during COVID. I didn't do it for praise. I did it because failure wasn't an option, not when people's paychecks depended on my accuracy. When Mr. Donnell, your founder and longtime CEO, announced his retirement, I didn't campaign for his role. I assumed they'd bring in someone from corporate, maybe someone with a polished resume and a soft handshake. But instead, they handed it to his son, Colin. Colin Donnelly. Freshly minted MBA from the East Coast. Armani suits, buzzwords, and a vision for modernization that smelled more like ego than strategy. Still, I kept my head down. I offered guidance. I even covered for him in front of the board when he stumbled through a quarterly report using outdated numbers. That's what team players do, right? But then came the cuts, the reassignments, the closed-door meetings I was no longer invited to. My input was no longer needed. My name disappeared from leadership briefs. Then came Kylie Collins, strategic advisor. 26, blonde, always vlogging, always sipping something lavender. She shadowed me for 3 days, took notes like she was filming a lifestyle reel, and asked if we still fax things here like in old movies. End of quote. That should have been my warning. But I ignored it. I told myself, just keep doing the work. Results speak for themselves. I didn't realize then that in rooms built on ego, results only matter if your name is on the PowerPoint. Still, I stayed. Not because I was weak, not because I didn't see it coming, but because there's a difference between being quiet and being blind. I wasn't blind. I saw every small betrayal, every shared wink across meetings, every email I was accidentally left off. And when they demoted me, when they moved me from the top floor to the front desk, they thought they were getting rid of dead weight. But what they really did was unlock the version of me they were never prepared to deal with. Not the fixer, not the loyalist, but the woman who knows exactly where the bones are buried because she buried them. It didn't happen overnight. That's the thing about betrayal, it rarely kicks the door in. It seeps in slowly, like water finding its way through a crack in the ceiling. At first, it's just a little stain, barely noticeable, easy to ignore. But you blink, and suddenly the drywall's caving in. For me, the first crack was a calendar invite, a strategy meeting I was always part of. This time, I wasn't included. I thought it was a mistake. Maybe the assistant forgot to tag me. So I asked Colin casually, "Hey, did the op sync get moved?" He smiled, polished and rehearsed, and said, "Oh, that one's just for executive alignment. Nothing you need to worry about, Madison." Nothing I need to worry about. The second crack came when my budget requests started getting held for review. Things that used to be rubber stamped now had to be escalated to Kylie for a second opinion. Kylie, who once asked me what a vendor retainer was, who thought our reconciliation was a customer loyalty program. She shadowed me with a pastel notebook and a lavender latte like she was prepping for a Pinterest career change. She called me Madsy once in a meeting right after interrupting me to explain my own system to the CFO. I smiled. I said nothing. But inside, something had already shifted. The third crack came from my team. They started getting reshuffled, quietly. One analyst got moved to corporate strategy under Kylie. One junior ops manager who I mentored for 2 years was suddenly assigned to a new leadership development initiative with no clear role. When I asked Colin about it, he just waved it off. "We're building for the future," he said. Funny thing is, I was the one who built the future. I created the scalable model we now used across 4 properties. I negotiated the digital onboarding platform they were bragging about on investor calls. I trained the very people they were now poaching for Kylie's Instagram-friendly reorg chart. Still, I told myself to breathe. I had weathered worse. Recessions, layoffs, hurricane evacuations. I didn't panic. But the fourth crack? That one split something deep. Colin stood up in a quarterly town hall, full of polished slides and buzzwords, and said, "We're entering a bold new phase zone that prioritizes agility over legacy." Then he looked right at me. I don't even think he meant to. It was just a flick of the eyes. But in that moment, I knew. This wasn't just about systems or strategy. This was personal. I was the legacy, the old guard, the too loyal to be useful, the last woman standing between Colin's ambition and a blank check from the board. And, worst of all, I had taught him everything he was now using against me. How to read an audit trail, how to spin a pivot table, how to talk in performance metrics and silence liabilities with budget constraints. Dua. I had handed him the blueprint. And now, he was using it to erase me. But here's the mistake they all made, the one that always comes up in stories like this. They thought I hadn't noticed. They mistook my silence for surrender. But I wasn't backing down. I was backing up and building receipts. It happened on a Wednesday. Wednesdays are harmless days. The middle of the week, forgettable, barely carrying enough energy to cause real damage. But that's what makes them dangerous. You never see a Wednesday coming. That morning, I arrived early like I always did. The front lobby was still quiet, just the hum of the espresso machine warming up and the distant sound of the housekeeping carts rolling down the hallway. I went to my office. Correction, what used to be my office. The keycard didn't work. I blinked, tried again. Nothing. I stared at the small red light blinking back at me like a warning signal. I didn't panic. Not right away. I thought, maybe it was a glitch. Maybe it was running some kind of update. So I walked down to the front desk, asked Marcus, the front shift supervisor, if he knew what was going on. He looked at me, hesitant, almost guilty. Madison? You might want to check your email. I did. And there it was. A single, 3-sentence message sent from an anonymous corporate ops notification address. Effective immediately, Madison Green will be reassigned to assist front desk operations at the Bourbon Royal Hotel. Please coordinate with guest services lead for scheduling. This move is part of our organizational alignment strategy. Thank you. No subject line. No signature. No warning. Just an erasure. I stood there for a full minute, reading it over and over, waiting for the punchline. But there wasn't one. I wasn't demoted. I was relocated. Stripped of my authority, my team, my title, without even the courtesy of a conversation. The same woman who had negotiated vendor contracts during a hurricane, who had run payroll with 2 fingers and a wrist brace, who had stayed on site during lockdown to ensure the business didn't collapse under unpaid invoices, was now being reassigned to hand out towels and restock mints. I walked back to the main desk. Kylie was already there, sipping her lavender latte like nothing happened. "Oh, hey, Madsy," she chirped, tapping her iPad. "So excited to have you on the ground with us. This is going to be like a leadership immersion moment, right?" She winked. Like this was some kind of game. Like she hadn't just participated in gutting everything I built. I didn't respond. I just nodded slowly, took the spare schedule clipboard from the counter, and turned away. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't even flinch. Because I knew this wasn't just a reassignment. It was a message. A very deliberate, very public move to humiliate me. Strip away the office. Strip away the title. Put her in a guest-facing role so she remembers her place. And maybe they thought that would be the end of me. Maybe they thought I'd hand in my resignation that same afternoon and walk out quietly, head bowed, dignity shattered. But here's the thing. When you've been underestimated your whole life, when you've had to fight for every inch of respect in rooms full of people who didn't think you belonged, you learn not to react. You learn to remember, to record, to breathe. Because storms don't announce themselves, they gather. And mine had just begun. I didn't rage. I didn't march into HR demanding explanations, or storm into Colin's glass-walled office and slam a resignation letter on his desk. That's what they wanted. That's what they expected. They wanted the scene, the meltdown, the emotional outburst, the difficult woman narrative they could spin to justify what they'd already done. But I didn't give them that. Instead, I did what I've always done best. I watched. You'd be surprised how much people reveal when they think you're no longer a threat. When you're standing behind a front desk in a navy blazer, holding a clipboard, they assume you're invisible. They talk freely. They overshare. They forget you were once the person who approved every vendor invoice and reviewed every payroll adjustment. I took notes. Mental ones at first. Then physical ones kept in a small leather notebook I kept tucked beneath the front counter. I logged every name Kylie mentioned when she bragged about realigning operations. I tracked every time Colin used my old pitch decks, just rebranded and stripped of context. And I started noticing patterns: missing receipts, payment authorizations that bypassed standard protocols, vendor names I'd never approved. One afternoon, I watched Kylie approve a $9,000 branding retainer for a firm based out of Miami. Except, I recognized the name. Not from the vendor list, but from Kylie's Instagram highlights. They had designed her personal wedding invitations. I didn't confront her. I took a screenshot. And when a barback from the rooftop lounge casually mentioned that the new CEO's girlfriend throws events using company inventory, I asked for dates and times. Not because I needed gossip, because I needed timestamps. Every quiet moment became data. Every overlooked slight became evidence. I started coming in early not to restock towels but to access the back office before anyone else arrived. I exported vendor logs. I cross-checked payment records. I pulled digital signatures and compared them to archived documents I still had from my tenure. And slowly, a story began to emerge. One that wasn't about bitterness or bruised ego. One about fraud. Small at first, petty misuse of funds, sloppy mismanagement masked as streamlining. But it grew. And with each discrepancy I uncovered, the more I realized this wasn't incompetence. It was intentional. They weren't just trying to replace me. They were trying to erase me, rewrite history, claim credit for the work I had spent years building while funneling resources into side projects, vanity partnerships, and personal perks. Still, I said nothing. No dramatic confrontations. No accusatory emails. Just silence. Because I wasn't just collecting receipts. I was building a timeline. A narrative that couldn't be denied or rewritten no matter how many glossy presentations they gave to the board. And every time Colin strutted through the lobby with that performative grin, every time Kylie smiled like she was doing me a favor by keeping me involved, I smiled right back. Because the truth was no longer buried. It was documented, labeled, time-stamped, and one day soon, it would speak louder than either of them ever could. It started with a name, buried inside one of the vendor logs, attached to a string of oddly timed payments, hollow bridge strategies. At first glance, it looked legitimate, branded invoice, digital letterhead, even a vague project description. Operational branding alignment. But when I ran the listed EIN number through a public database, I found something strange. It didn't exist. Not in Louisiana, not in Florida, not anywhere a legal business entity should appear. The address? A co-working space in Atlanta. The contact number? Redirected to a generic voicemail box. The domain name? Purchased 3 weeks ago. I didn't panic. I just kept digging. Another payment, this time to Byron Creative Advisors. Supposedly for strategy consultation related to our upcoming summer hospitality expansion. Except I'd never heard of any expansion. And the project file it was linked to? Canceled 6 months ago. I cross-referenced internal memos, payroll logs, even Slack archives. These transactions weren't just suspicious. They were fabricated, inserted post-approval into expense clusters no one usually reviewed twice. And all of them had one thing in common: authorized by Colin or routed through Kylie's oversight. That's when I realized I needed help. Not just a sounding board. Not a friend. I needed someone above Colin. Someone with institutional memory, discretion, and access. There was only one name that came to mind. Elaine Whitaker. Elaine wasn't flashy. She didn't show up at quarterly meetings in tailored blazers or deliver keynote speeches. But she'd worked quietly at the parent company's internal audit division for 15 years. And she had a reputation, a silent one, for asking the right questions and never looking away from hard answers. We hadn't spoken in over a year, but late one night, I drafted an email. Not emotional, not accusatory, just clean and clinical. Hey Elaine, I've noticed several anomalies within vendor logs linked to Bourbon Royale operations, alongside irregular approval protocols bypassing compliance thresholds. Would you be open to reviewing a few items with me, discreetly? I attached a single PDF. No commentary. Just the facts. She replied the next morning. Call me. Direct line. Encrypted. The tone said everything. When we spoke, I laid out the pattern on file at a time. She didn't interrupt. Didn't react. Just listened, asked precise questions, and requested source data. Not summaries. Source. That's how I knew she was serious. Over the next 7 days, I became the curator of a private archive. OD lug. Reconstructed timelines. Original versions of altered memos. Comparison reports between expense filings and system backups I had archived long ago. I used neutral language. No opinions. Just observations. Elaine never offered opinions either. She didn't need to. But I noticed her requests becoming more specific. She asked for metadata, for IP traces on signatures, for access history on shared folders I thought no one noticed. By the end of the week, she said one sentence I'll never forget. Keep backing up everything externally. Quietly, don't stop. That was all the confirmation I needed. I wasn't alone anymore. What I was building wasn't just a case. It was a countdown. And when it hit 0, I wasn't going to be the one scrambling for an alibi. It came in an attachment. At the bottom of an all-staff announcement, buried beneath a sea of buzzwords like synergy realignment and initiative-driven recalibration, was a link to a compliance memo. No fanfare, no explanation, just a small note. This confirms regulatory approval of the summer payroll transition process. I clicked on it. I didn't expect much, just another generic document dressed in corporate jargon. But the second the PDF opened, I felt my stomach tighten. The formatting was familiar. Too familiar. The headers, the phrasing, the spacing between bullet points, it was mine. My work. My template. Except, I hadn't written this one. I scanned to the bottom. There it was. My signature. Perfectly placed. Digitally rendered. Time-stamped from 2 months ago. Except, I knew for a fact, I had never signed that version of the document. Because the original didn't say what this one said. This version included new approval thresholds higher than what I'd ever approved. It claimed the system had undergone internal audit reconciliation, referencing protocols that didn't exist when I was still in charge. And worst of all, it retroactively justified several vendor payouts that I had flagged just last week. Whoever created this document didn't just borrow my format. They forged it. Used my name, my authority, and my trust. For a few seconds, I just sat there. Not shocked. Not even angry. Just cold. That kind of cold that settles in your spine when you realize someone thinks you're stupid enough to let this slide. Someone thought I was already gone. That I wouldn't look. That I wouldn't remember my own damn signature. I forwarded the document to Elaine. Simple subject line. Please review, forgery suspected. She replied 6 minutes later. One word. Confirmed. No exclamation mark. No elaboration. Just the truth. Sharpened. Surgical. That evening, Elaine initiated what she called quiet escalation. A term I'd never heard before but instantly understood. She wasn't sending this to HR. Not yet. She was preparing something bigger. She instructed me to collect all drafts of the original document I'd authored. Versions, timestamps, metadata trails, anything that showed the differences between the real and the fake. I did more than that. I exported system logs showing that Colin accessed the folder the fake memo came from 3 days before the document was created. I pulled device history. The forged file had been uploaded using a secondary admin credential I recognized as Kylie's temp login from last quarter. They didn't just forge a document. They left fingerprints all over the crime scene. And that's the thing about arrogance, it makes you sloppy. Colin thought no one would notice. That no one would question a PDF in a sea of corporate noise. But I saw it. Because I built it. Because I still had the keys. And because people like Colin forget that legacy doesn't just mean old. Sometimes, legacy means unerasable. That night, I made a new folder. Labeled it Trigger. No, so. Inside, I placed every file, every screenshot, every forged timestamp. And I knew. The next move wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to the machine. The one that never speaks until it's ready to crush you. It happened on a Monday. Of course it did. Because corporate betrayals don't wait for dramatic timing. They arrive precisely when you're still shaking off the weekend, sipping bad coffee, and hoping this week might be quieter than the last. But this Monday was different. I knew the moment I opened my inbox. There it was, a meeting invite. Subject line. Q Troy Realignment Review. Executive attendance required. No agenda. No attachments. Just a time. A room. And 3 names quietly CC'd in the invite. Colin Donnelly. Kylie Brooks. Madison Green. I felt my breath pause in my chest. Elaine had warned me the wheels were moving, but not when. Not how. Now I knew. I arrived 10 minutes early. The boardroom was colder than usual. Maybe it was just the decor, maybe it was the tension already hanging in the air. Executive chairs lined the long glass table, but no one was seated yet. Except for one man. Arthur Langston, chairman of the board. He didn't look up when I entered. Just nodded once. That was enough. Within minutes, the others trickled in legal counsel, CFO, operations VPs. And then, at 10:02, Colin strolled in, latte in hand, blazer slightly wrinkled, wearing that same smug confidence of a man who still thought the game was his to win. Kylie followed close behind, trying to look important in her tailored pantsuit and oversized tablet she didn't know how to use. The meeting began like any other. Colin stood, clicked his presentation remote, and launched into a slideshow about organizational evolution. Words like efficiency, innovation, and fresh vision spilled across the screen. He smiled, gestured, nodded at his own slides. But no one was nodding back. 3 slides in, he said. Before we dive deeper, I'd like to clarify that all recent operational transitions have been fully vetted and approved through compliance. We even have documentation to confirm it. He clicked again. A PDF appeared on the screen. The forged document. I didn't flinch. Neither did Arthur Langston. Instead, he leaned forward and said, almost gently, "Mr. Donnelly, where did this document originate?" Colin paused. "It's from our internal compliance archive. Standard approval memo, signed by..." He froze. Because the next slide wasn't his. It had been overridden. Up on the screen now. A watermark. Unauthorized document use. Internal audit investigation. Below that, a timeline of access history. IP addresses. User logins. And at the center of it all, Colin Donnelly. Kylie Brooks. Kylie let out a small gasp. Colin reached for the laptop, but Arthur raised a hand. "You'll want to sit down now." And he did. Hard. Elaine's voice entered the room next, calm, crisp, and piped in remotely via speaker. She began listing findings. Misused vendor payments. Forged digital signatures. Unauthorized overrides of expense thresholds. System logs confirming deliberate obfuscation. Colin stammered. This has to be a mistake." Arthur cut him off. "No, Colin. The mistake was thinking no one was watching." Kylie tried to speak something about lack of training and miscommunication, but the legal counsel had already slid a sealed folder across the table. Inside were termination protocols. For both of them, the silence was thick. Absolute. And then, for the first time, Arthur turned to me. "Madison," he said, "thank you for maintaining the integrity of this company when others lost their way." I didn't nod. I didn't smile. I just replied, "I was never gone. I was just watching." And for the first time in months, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Stillness. Not the stillness of fear. The stillness of power returning to where it belonged. They didn't clap. There was no applause. No formal declaration. No ceremonial key handoff or viral LinkedIn post. Just silence. That's how real power shifts. Not with a bang, but with a blink, with a breath. With a door that closes a little softer than usual but locks behind the people who thought it would never shut on them. After the meeting, no one said much. Colin left without his laptop. Kylie cried quietly in the hallway, trying to reach someone on her phone who wasn't picking up. Legal escorted them both out, not with force, but with finality. And I stayed seated. The board slowly filtered out. A few nodded my way. Some avoided eye contact. One quietly whispered, "Well done." But I didn't come for praise. I came for clarity, and now I had it. When the room was nearly empty, Arthur Langston approached me again. He didn't shake my hand or make a speech. He just slid a small envelope across the table and said, "It's already signed." Inside was the new appointment letter. Interim Chief Operating Officer. Reporting directly to the board, with oversight authority across the Gulf region properties. No ceremony. No extra clauses. Just a single line at the bottom. In recognition of service beyond duty and integrity without compromise. I read it. Once. Then folded it, placed it back in the envelope, and slipped it into my bag. It wasn't pride I felt. Or triumph. It was stillness. That heavy, echoing stillness that comes after a storm finally passes. Not because it spared you, but because you learned how to survive it. Later that afternoon, I took the elevator not to my old office, but to the rooftop. The sun was low. The wind carried the scent of lemon and chlorine from the rooftop bar where Kylie once held strategy sessions with influencers. Now, it was empty. I looked out over the city New Orleans, stretching out in every direction, stubborn and wild and burning with history. Just like me. And then I pulled out my phone, scrolled to a contact I hadn't dialed in years. Donnelly Sr. He answered on the second ring. "Madison," he said, voice gravel and bourbon. I heard. I paused. "Was it you who pulled the final string?" He laughed once. "No, darling. I just made sure the right people had the scissors." There was a long silence between us. The kind that only exists between two people who know exactly what it costs to build something real. "I'm stepping in temporarily," I finally said. "But I won't stay forever." "I wouldn't expect you to," he replied. "Just long enough to teach the next one how to hold the sword without cutting their own hand." End quote. I hung up a minute later. No goodbye. Just a quiet nod between legacies. And that night, I went home not to an inbox full of fires to put out, not to panic or press releases or damage control. I lit a candle, took off my shoes, and opened a notebook not to log receipts, but to begin something new. A handbook. A guide. For whoever came after me. Because power isn't something you seize and hoard. It's something you build, defend, then pass on, when the time is right. Here's what they never teach you in business school. Sometimes, the strongest person in the room is the one who says the least. Not because they're unsure. Not because they're passive. But because they understand something deeper than ego or noise or performative leadership ever will. Silence isn't weakness. It's strategy. For years, I thought the only way to survive in a corporate world was to be indispensable. To work harder, stay longer, no more. I believed that if I gave enough, if I showed enough loyalty, enough grit, enough proof of my value, then no one could take my place. But they did. Not because I wasn't good enough, but because politics doesn't care how hard you worked if it can rewrite the credits. What I learned is that being great at your job doesn't always protect you. Sometimes, people will still push you aside because you remind them of what they didn't build. Because your quiet competence threatens their loud ambition. So what do? You remember who you are. You don't yell. You document. You don't beg for respect. You preserve your dignity while building your case. You protect your values, even when they're not trending. And you understand that legacy isn't what they say about you in press releases, what remains intact when their story falls apart. Colin tried to erase me. Kylie tried to wear my systems like accessories. They thought they could copy the blueprint without honoring the architect. But real value isn't surface deep. Real value survives rebranding. It outlasts lies. It doesn't need a megaphone because truth whispers in ways noise never can. I didn't take them down with fury. I didn't burn the building down. I simply showed them what they built in. My foundation was full of cracks. And I let it fall. So, if you're listening to this, wondering whether to speak up or stay silent, know this. Silence is not the absence of power. It's the presence of control. You can be graceful and dangerous. You can be invisible and irreplaceable. You can lose your title and still own the room. Your job is not your worth. Your position is not your power. Your legacy is not theirs to define. Because one day, maybe not now, maybe not tomorrow, but one day, they'll remember the one who stayed late, who built the thing that still works long after the flashy names are gone, who never needed revenge, because integrity was loud enough. In every story of downfall, there's always someone who panics too soon. Someone who sees the storm coming and instead of preparing, tries to outrun it with a torch in hand, lighting fires they can't control. In this story, that person was Kylie Brooks. I hadn't seen her for 2 days after the board meeting. Word around the building was that she'd taken personal time. But in reality, she was working behind the scenestreing, desperately, to salvage her image, her job, her grip on a reality that had already slipped away. And then she made a mistake. A very public, very traceable, very fatal mistake. She sent an email. Not to legal. Not to HR. Not even to Arthur Langston or the audit team. She sent it to the entire corporate mailing list and internal distribution group titled Execall Global, which included every senior staff member across North America, Europe, and Southeast Asia. Her subject line? A clarification about recent events from someone who knows the whole story. I remember where I was when it hit my inbox. In the guest lounge, walking past the fireplace on my way to greet a visiting regional director. I didn't even need to open it to know what it was. The subject line screamed panic. Still, I clicked. Inside was a 6-paragraph manifesto. Kylie framed herself as a bystander caught between warring factions, blamed Elaine for creating a toxic atmosphere of surveillance, and accused me of running a shadow campaign against leadership, citing jealousy and a resistance to change. She even attached a PDF labeled Timeline of Madison's Disruption, which, hilariously, included emails I hadn't even written and files with broken links. But here's where it backfired spectacularly. In her rush to defend herself, Kylie forgot to check her CC line. Because she didn't just send this to Execall Global. She also CC'd the entire Audit Oversight Committee. And without realizing it, she included, in one of her screenshots, a forwarded message between her and Colin where they explicitly discussed altering invoice descriptions to keep things clean for the board. That one image? It was a confession. A smoking gun. Within 15 minutes, the email was retracted by IT. Within 30, Audit had opened a second investigation, this time focused solely on her. And within 48 hours, Kylie Brooks was not only terminated, but also issued a legal notice for breach of compliance and willful misrepresentation. The worst part? She didn't even realize her mistake until it was too late, because panic doesn't just make you reckless, it makes you blind. I didn't reply to the email. I didn't have to. Her words, her tone, her desperation, it did all the speaking for her. And as I watched the fallout unfold, I wasn't angry, I wasn't smug. I was quietly resolute. Because sometimes, you don't need to strike the final blow. Sometimes, your enemies will swing so wildly, they fall on their own sword. I stayed exactly 79 days after the board meeting. Long enough to clean up the mess. Long enough to stabilize what Colin tried to turn into chaos. Long enough to ensure that the systems were realigned, not just cosmetically patched. But not a day longer. I didn't want the permanent position. People asked why. You've earned it, they said. You deserve the title, the corner office, the salary bump. But that was never the point. I didn't walk through fire to claim a bigger desk. I walked through fire to prove I was never meant to be burned in the first place. So, on a Tuesday, fittingly quiet, much like the day they tried to erase me, I walked into Arthur Langston's office with a folder in hand. Inside, my resignation letter. Short, respectful, absolute. He looked at it, then at me. Are you sure? I'm not just sure, I said. I'm ready. No drama. No second guessing. Just a woman who understood something most leaders forget. Sometimes real power is knowing when to let go. I trained my replacement, someone I mentored years ago. Her name was Vanessa. Bright. Steady. Not loud, but sharp in all the ways that matter. She didn't ask for the spotlight, and that's how I knew she was the right choice. I left her the handbook I'd been writing, a collection of everything I wished someone had told me when I first walked into a leadership role. Not just policies and procedures, but wisdom. How to hold people accountable without humiliation. How to navigate betrayal without letting it change who you are. How to stay quiet without becoming invisible. And when my final day came, I didn't make a speech. I didn't want a party. I simply packed my things, one box, one coffee mug, one photo from the old days, and I left my badge on the desk. The same desk where they once tried to reduce me to silence. And then, I walked out the front doors not as a survivor of sabotage, not as a temporary executive, not as the woman who brought down the Donnelly boy. I walked out as myself. Whole, clear, uncompromised. I moved to Colorado, bought a small cabin near Estes Park, opened a boutique retreat center, not big, not flashy, just quiet, peaceful, intentional. Now, I spend my mornings walking under pine trees and my afternoons mentoring young women who think they have to scream to be heard. I tell them the truth, you don't. You just have to stand. Even when they push. Even when they whisper. Even when they try to move you off the board like you're just another piece. Because if you know your value, if you hold your ground with grace, if you play the long game with patience, eventually, the board will flip itself. And when it does, you won't need revenge. You won't need titles. You won't need the last word. You'll already be gone. But the blueprint you left behind? That will still be running the show.